Alrighty, we are just about ready to start this evening. I can see lots of people are starting to log on, so we'll begin in probably about 60 seconds or so. Alrighty, let's jump into it for the evening. Welcome everyone to the second webinar series for this term, in our second term of the year. And just to start off, hello everyone, my name is Jake if you haven't been here before, but if you have been here before, then you may notice that we're in a slightly different locale tonight. And I have the absolute pleasure of being in Sydney, in the head office, in HQ so to speak, delivering this webinar where so many greats have delivered it from before. You may recognize it if you were part of our series last year, but if not, I do, and I'm very pleased to give you this warning, but there is a very lively restaurant downstairs who do love to play kind of ABBA-esque disco type tunes, sometimes very loudly, particularly when they're celebrating. So if that does happen, just bear with us for a little bit. It will die down eventually and we will keep talking about study skills, which of course is why we are here tonight. Our entire ethos is about study skills, what gets us going, and it's what we do with our students and of course with our families and our parents one-to-one. And tonight we are speaking about one of those really core, one of those really tangible study skills, and of course that is memory. How students can improve their memory and how you as parents can help them along that journey. So for the evening, the way it's going to run is I'm going to give a quick introduction to who Elevate is and what we do. I apologize for those of you who are frequent flyers. You've probably heard it before, but I do want to make sure everyone is on the same page. Then we're going to jump into the webinar proper. We're going to be talking about memory, 3 parts: attention, storage, and recall. And then finally, we're going to have a Q&A session at the end. It is always fantastic. We get great questions coming from parents. So if you already have any burning questions, please send them through. If you're on our website, in the bottom right-hand corner should be a kind of pink chat bubble looking thing. Click that, it'll open up the chat box, send them through. If you've made it all the way through to YouTube, no worries. On the right-hand side, you should see a gray box. And there is a chat function there as well. We have some Rockstar team members here tonight ready to receive your questions. Feed me some of those so I can read them out live here. All right, so who is Elevate Education? We are the global leader in the delivery of study skills. We've been around for 20 years, and for the last 20 years, we've been focusing on our research question. And that question is, what is it that the top students are doing that allows them to get the top marks? And the most common answer, the most common heuristic that people tend to jump to is IQ, is intelligence. That is that the people who do the best in school are naturally smart, so to speak. And what we have found across the last 20 years is that that is very far from the truth. And in fact, there are these 13 key study habits, these study skills that these top students are using that demarcates them from the middle and the lower performing bands. And so we take those study skills, we repackage them, and we deliver them to our students in seminars. We work with students and families one-on-one privately, and more recently, we can talk to parents and staff in a situation like this. So, jumping straight into it, let's talk about some of these study skills, particularly in regards to memory, and I'm going to kind of focus on one of the students that we worked with in one of our coaching programs. Now, at the start of all of our coaching programs, we run a diagnostic interview. It's a free initial assessment. It's about 65 questions, and we really focus in on where are the students' strengths and where are their weaknesses. We really want to find out what the problems are. And to think back to one of the quotations from Einstein that we love to talk about here, if I had an hour to solve a problem, I would spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes thinking about the solution, because understanding that root cause really is the name of the game for the start of our coaching program and for getting students on the right track in terms of their study skills. So for this student, Lila, particularly when it came to memory, she struggled. She would always say things like, I have a bad memory. I just can't remember things. And lots of students say that without actually knowing what memory is. So the three things we noticed was that firstly, Lila got really distracted and she lacked focus. Even in that initial 65-minute interview, she was looking around, she couldn't focus, she was super distracted, and it went all the way throughout her work. She was always on her phone, things around the house, things on her desk were distracting her. Getting the work done was really, really hard. The second thing that we noticed with Lila is that she had difficulty memorizing concepts, particularly in those content-heavy subjects, your biologies, your economics, your histories, things with lots of info was a big struggle. And as a result, she'd give up early. She would say things like, I can't do this, what's even the point? And the third thing we noticed with Lila was that dreaded mind blank. And I'm sure we can all relate to this. You memorize things, you know it's on the tip of the tongue in some presentation, maybe you're giving a parent webinar and you just can't quite think of the right word that you have to say. And it's a massive source of anxiety. And for Lila, it was a massive source of exam anxiety. She really struggled to overcome it, which led for her to a big reduction in confidence and a spiking anxiety. And these three things really nicely sum up a few symptoms of some poor memory techniques. But before we jump into that, I really want to know, does any of this apply to you? Open up that chat box. If you have seen any of these symptoms, either in yourself or in your child, put the number in, send it through to us. Is it 1, 2, 3, all of them, 1 or 2? Whatever it is, let us know if you can see this in your child. Because each of these symptoms really nicely link to those core tenets of memory that I was speaking about before: attention, storage, and recall. And this is what we're going to look at tonight. So firstly, attention. If your child, or rather, if you can't pay attention to something, there is no way you're ever going to be able to memorize it. So how on earth do we increase that? In terms of storage, how do we actually encode information into our brain when it comes to exams? Because there are going to be effective and there are going to be ineffective techniques to make that link between short and long-term memory. And then finally, when we come to recall, can you actually revise the information? Can you go over it? Can you put your pen to paper when time counts? Or can you recall someone's name when you run into them in the street and you should know who they are, but you just can't think of their name? So, for Lila, we gave her some tips for each one of these facets of memory to help her out. And if you could improve each of these by, say, 5, 10, 15% would be really good. By just focusing on some of the skills that are required for each of them, then that follows that your marks should improve. And what we found is for Lila, when we did work on these, we found that her marks improved across the board by 23%. And there was particular emphasis on these content-heavy subjects, which a lot of students find really tricky. And so like I said, today we're going to be going over these 3 core tenets of memory. The beauty is you do not have to change them all at once. At Elevate, we always say, focus on one thing at a time. Once you have that first study skill down pat, then move on to the next one, then move on to the next one. And what you will start to see is you have compound interest working for you over time. And your outcome could be marks, it could be less stress, greater well-being, more confidence, whatever it is. Just focus on one thing at a time. Okay. Let's jump into this first part of the webinar. I'll get everyone to open up their chat box. I'm going to start with one of the questions that we like to use in our study skills interview. Like I said, we frame the problem first. Normally there's 65 of them. I'm just going to use this one to frame the first part of the session. And that is, what distracts your child the most? Is it A, their phone, B, social media, C, video games, D, Netflix, E, music? I'm going to throw in F, all of the above. Is it G, none of the above, something else? Put them into the chat box, let us know. I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to send all of those answers in. Have a think about what distracts your child the absolute most. And what I will expect to see, and yes, I can start to see them coming through the chat indeed, what I'm expecting to see is that most parents are going to say A or B, because these are the most common things that distract students, as you'll know from our time management webinar. And the core question that a lot of our parents have for us is my child being effective when there are all of these other distractions going on? And just a quick spoiler for you, the answer is no. But to move on to a quotation from Vilfredo Pareto, you've probably heard of the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule. He says that 80% of the effects come from 20% of the causes. Now, in relation to attention, what vies for our attention? Because there are probably a very small part of these causes taking our attention away that are responsible for a large part of the deficit. And it's actually a massive issue. So I'm going to focus on 2 skills, 2 ideas that we can use to start to increase our attention process, particularly when it comes time to studying. Now, the first one here in terms of attention is a bit of a myth that I'm going to talk about, and that is that multitasking is a myth. If anyone, if you or your child or your colleagues say they are multitasking, unfortunately, they are not. So, I'm going to make this a little bit interactive. We often do this with our students, and I apologize. I would love if you could do it with me. If your child is next to you, I'm really sorry. I promise this activity will make a point. So, what I'm going to get everyone to do is to hold up 4 fingers on one hand and then kind of to shoot it with your other hand, kind of like that. I'm going to do this in 2 parts because it's actually a kind of double-barreled activity. The first thing we're going to start doing is just by switching over the hands. So one goes to 4 fingers, the other one goes to a finger gun. Now, while you are doing that, I then want you to recall what was your entire shopping list the last time you went to a supermarket. Start from the top, work your way all the way through the supermarket, see if you can continue shooting 4 while also thinking about the things you bought from the supermarket. I'll give you 10 seconds or so to do that before you can holster away those fingers and we can move on with where the point is in that. Okay, all right, you can put them away. Now, usually when we do something like this, one of 2 things happen. People either stare at their fingers and say, this is too hard, I'm going to give up because I can't do it because it's too much cognitive load. Or people tend to have 5, they can't work out how to do 4, or they start saying things and they stop saying their supermarket list because it's too much cognitive load, it's too hard to do. The point here is that multitasking doesn't actually exist. When you are doing this task, you are trying to do 2 different tasks, even though you think you're doing them concurrently in some sort of mythical multitasking kind of scenario, but you're actually switching your attention. I'll get to that in a second. The next thing I've got up here is a bridge. And this is to make this analogy a little bit more kind of mental focused or work focused. When you switch your attention between tasks, you are paying a toll, much like you go across a toll bridge. If you go from A to B, you pay a toll. When you go from B to A, you pay a toll going back. This bridge represents an attentional toll for switching tasks or from toggling tasks. Every time you switch between them, you lose a bit of attention or a bit of efficiency. You create essentially an attention debt. And this is what happens when people try to multitask. We're not actually multitasking. Like I said, we are rapidly switching between 2 different tasks. It's called attention toggling. And the problem here is that microsecond to microsecond, you cannot see what is happening in your brain, but you're actually losing efficiency every time that you do it. Particularly if your son or daughter is studying at a desk where there are so many things to be distracted by, we're going to be continually losing efficiency by all of these things. So, the first thing is 1 task at a time. This is the first piece of advice. If you listen to any super successful entrepreneur, the example that comes to my head is Bill Gates, very topical right now, but they will always speak about the superpower of focus and how if focusing on one thing at a time is kind of like a superpower. Because like I said, splitting your attention across things like phones, television, different WhatsApp groups, even 2 different pieces of work, you are going to drastically decrease the efficiency of both tasks. The second piece of advice that relates to that is have a clean desk. And I know this seems like the most obvious thing ever, and I know parents know this. So in terms of looking at where we study, where we work, we need to examine what happens in our subconscious when there's so many things scattered across the desk. And what the neuroscience shows is that all of this clutter, your subconscious is actually processing it the entire time. And it creates this feeling of tension, this feeling of overwhelm that seemingly comes from nowhere, which creates a cause and effect link between not being able to focus and having too many things in your environment. Which is why we find things like avoidance behavior become really, really common when someone has a messy environment. And to go into what a messy environment is just a little bit, it can be either the external environment, the desk, lots of things on it, makes sense, but it can also be your internal environment. If you're thinking about a bunch of things at once, if you're stressed, if your mind is elsewhere, it's going to be really hard to get effective work done. And the final thing we've got down here is to limit multiple tabs. Again, seems really obvious. One of the best ways of implementing these things, it's kind of like having a clean desk, but in the laptop version. If you have different tabs, YouTube, Facebook, online shopping open, it's going to be really easy to get distracted. Close it up, clean up your laptop screen, and it'll be much easier to get work done. So, in terms of more macro implementation, how do we get these things to happen? Well, of course, we love using the weekly tracker. So, for every week or for every day that you have a clean study space, you get a tick, you track your progress over time. We use those experiential incentives at the end about whether or not there was a clean desk or in the study environment. The only other thing that I want to mention here, because it's relevant to this part, is I love studying outside of my bedroom at clean spaces. Kitchen tables, libraries, always good because the table's always clean. But I know that's not an option for a lot of people, and people do like studying in their room. If you have a desk in your room, we recommend, or the neuroscience recommends, that you face it away from the bed. Because if the bed is in your vision while trying to study, there is this subconscious link, this unconscious link with that kind of gets a student thinking subconsciously, I should be lying down, I should be sleeping, and they get a little bit tired, and of course their attention decreases. All right, that is the first part here. I'm going to jump into the second part. And I'm pretty sure I can hear groans, smirks, eyes rolling of parents all around Australia right now. The number 2 is no music while studying. And it is, without a doubt, the number 1 loggerhead that parents come to when they talk to their children, particularly around attention or memorization. Now, you as parents know intuitively, students shouldn't be listening to music when they're studying. You know there's something wrong with it. But what our parents tend to try is they'll go to their child and they say, hey, you shouldn't listen to music. And instantly that child will recoil. They'll snap back and say, no, mum, no, dad, I need it. I can't study without it. And I'm sure there are so many parents here who have had that experience. The issue with music, or one of the issues with music, because there is a few, is that students develop a bit of an overconfidence while studying with it. It makes them feel good. And when they feel good, they're more likely to do stuff. So they sit with their music, but they are probably halving their attention, because half of their attention is going towards memorizing the lyrics to Taylor Swift's I Knew You Were Trouble, and the other half goes towards their work. So a student will actually have to do more work while listening, but they don't realize it because they feel good. They feel like they're being productive. So what we can do, and this is what I recommend for you, is point towards the research, lean on that. And I'll also provide a piece of advice that might help you, that I have mentioned before and we use with Lila, which really helped them as well. So the research shows music can improve performance in manual tasks. There are thousands of studies, particularly in weightlifters and athletes. You can see a 1 to 2% increase in these manual tasks, particularly if you've got that music, it's at the right beats per minute, getting pumped up. People listen to the heavy metal in the gym or their trance music, that can work. Also doing things like remedial tasks, and I love to think of the remedial tasks that I do, like cleaning my room, vacuuming the house, cooking, that kind of stuff, because it gets you pumped up, it's fine. Now, the second thing that I want to say is that classical music does not make your child smarter. Massive phase, it kind of still exists. It was more popular about 15 years ago, but unfortunately for Mozart, not the case. Now, the really important part is that generally, music does decrease performance in academic tasks. And like I said before, there is going to be that percentage of attention that is directed away from the task itself, and therefore you have to do more work to get the same result. So the question becomes, what can you as parents do? Because students will so often say, I don't care about the research, I like my music, it makes me happy. The reality is, we should aim rather, to wean students off music eventually. And a really important first step is listening to music without lyrics, because lyrics have a much larger attentional draw than music without words. Makes sense. Humans are social creatures, we communicate through language. If there are words around, we're going to listen to them. However, there is a conditioning process that happens if a student is familiar with performing when there is music. So they will get to their exam, there will be no music, and then subconsciously or even consciously there's a mismatch, and it creates a point of stress, and it makes it harder for your brain to perform. Now, in saying that, students do love music, and there is lots and lots of work that, there we go, this is the music that we all thought was going to happen. And like I said, we'll keep talking about study skills, and hopefully the music doesn't distract me too much. What a pertinent point. The compromise we make, and I've said this before, is that there is so much work that a student has to do throughout their entire high school career. So for remedial tasks, for things like making to-do lists, making weekly planners, doing a little bit of research, formatting an essay, I would usually say music is fine. This is for the low-powered brain tasks. When it comes time to the high-powered brain tasks, great time to switch off the music, that's when we say no music. When we're talking about memorization, when we're talking about practice papers, that is when I say to a student, we really need to be doing this without distraction. Now, one of the really useful things that we find in our coaching program is simply changing the messenger. Getting a coach to explain to students often leads them to being a little bit more receptive. If that's something that you want to try, we can absolutely have a go at that. Now, the one thing I haven't really mentioned in terms of attention, which is absolutely important, is sleep. I won't be going into much detail about that tonight because we have another webinar in 4 weeks' time, which is all about sleep and well-being. There is one in 2 weeks' time. It's about something else I'll talk about at the end. But in 4 weeks' time, we'll be speaking about sleep and well-being and the importance of that for cognitive performance. So that is attention. Let's move on to the next part, which is storage. Again, I'll direct you to that chat box. We're going to start with another question to frame this next part. So here we go. Question number 2. How does your child memorize information? We are going to be speaking about specific techniques that your children or that our students can use to get info in. So open up that chat box. Do they A, read their notes over and over and over again? Do they write them out lots of times, particularly for things like English essays, humanities essays? Do they C, quiz themselves? Do they D, use mind maps or visual aids? Or is there something else they do? I'm going to give you 10 seconds or so, and then I'll reveal the answers that we have based on some of our own research. All righty. And as expected, from me being able to see some of your answers coming through, and as you'll see when I flick onto the next slide, this is what our research shows. The vast majority of students are using either A or B. Now, when we conduct this research, we do surveys with schools around the world, with our students we work with our, kind of at schools and also in our coaching program. We can get this really interesting data about global trends. We can stay current. This one's from a relatively small sample size, about 180 students, self-reporting how they memorize. And as you can see, the two biggest ones are that students will memorize information by reading over and over or by writing over and over. And this makes up a whopping 82.6% of the student population using this as their main method of memorization. And that's really consistent with a lot of other research out, which shows that 80 to 90% of students, no matter what year level, use these rote learning techniques for their memory. And this is based on intuition, because when you say to a student, go memorize your notes, they'll rely on their intuition. They'll think, all right, I can memorize, I'll just write it out again and again, or I'll read it over again and again. Because they are not taught other techniques, which is a real problem. Because rote learning is one of the most ineffective and inefficient techniques when it comes to memorization. And this gets reinforced by past experience, because students will do this when they're younger. They'll do it, they'll get a good mark, and then they'll think, all right, that's worked, I'm going to continue to do the same thing. And it creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's a big problem. It takes ages to memorize like this. So for Lila, our student, it might take her an hour to memorize 10 quotes. And so if we are looking to halve that time, we have to move away from these techniques. We have to use different techniques. And tonight I'm going to go through just 2 of them. I unfortunately can't go through them all because of timing, but I will go through 2 that help move away from rote learning. The first one's based on understanding, and the second one is one of those higher order memory techniques based on kind of the work from Grand Master Memory Champions. Yes, they exist, and I'll talk about them in just a second. But first, I want to get to one of these quotations that you are probably familiar with from Albert Einstein. You do not really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. It's often also quoted as unless you can explain it to a 6-year-old, but the point here is the same. When you truly understand a concept, when you truly understand a piece of information, you can explain it very simply. And I'm sure you have heard bits of information, talks, meetings from people who don't understand their content so well. And so they're using these long, complex words. It doesn't really make sense. It doesn't quite click. So the first technique here is called the Feynman technique. And basically it is, in order to learn, you must teach. It's based on the work from Richard Feynman, very famous Nobel Prize laureate who works on the Manhattan Project. He's a phenomenal teacher, quirky guy, and this was his whole thing. So in the same way that I'm hopefully sharing some very useful information with you, I'm reinforcing it for myself the entire time that I'm teaching it. If your child is sitting at their desk just reading or writing, we really want to push them to get up, teach it to someone, because that is going to be a much more effective way of understanding, which of course is going to be linked into memory. We do this with our students all the time. When our coaches teach their students their study skills, the first thing they get them to do is ask their student to reteach it back to them. Then we take it a step further to apply it to a real life situation to ensure that they have that understanding. Same thing for subjects. If a student is trying to learn a particular subject, we get them to explain those concepts back to us, ask them to explain them to their parents, to their friends, to their dog, whatever it is. So, how does this technique work? Firstly, get your notes. Then explain that concept to someone. And like I said, the process of articulating it, saying things simply, pushing yourself to understand is really, really important. In that situation where when you are listening to someone explaining something and they're using all these big words, you're thinking, I have no idea what they're saying, the most likely scenario that has happened is that they have just remembered the language around it. They've read it and kind of learned that content. They don't actually understand the concept, which is not what we want for our students. Now, as parents, you can absolutely pitch in here. Listen to the concepts, then come in for the next step, which is to get asked questions. Ask a few simple questions around this concept, see if the student can kind of really flesh out that understanding and stretch their brain a bit. And the final thing we do is grade it on a traffic light scale. So both the person explaining and the person being explained to grade that process. So obviously if it's green, then the person explaining said, yep, I felt all over that. The person listening said, yeah, I understood everything that you said. For orange, it's I felt a little bit uncomfortable, wasn't too sure. Yeah, there was a few things missing. And for red, the person explaining says, I have no idea, I need to go back and review that. And marking down this traffic light system when a student has their notes informs a direct pathway, an easy track to follow of where a student should spend their time when it comes to studying for exams. You start by moving the reds, the oranges, and the oranges to the green. Then of course you repeat the process again and again until we can be as close as possible to green everywhere. Now, as a kind of bonus section here, another great way that some of our families that we work with love to use this technique is to actually get a whiteboard so that a child can actually teach it to their parent like they were being a teacher. They can teach it to anyone, and at Elevate, we absolutely love whiteboards. For any students that have seen our seminars, we're very proud of our whiteboard skills, and I have absolutely adopted this into my uni work. I've mentioned before, I've been at uni for 7 years now. This whiteboard and this teaching process has been one of my best friends the entire time. I just wish someone had told me early in high school how useful it was going to be. So, students can teach their parents, they can teach their friends, to an empty room, to their dog, whatever it is. That is the technique. That's the first one for storage. It ticks off that understanding component that allows us to link things to memory. Now, the other thing to say is that there is obviously also an importance in having raw content knowledge. The reality is, if you said to a 4-year-old, please memorize the Krebs cycle, they could get there and they could try to understand things, but it's going to be much easier if they have a few pieces of raw information along the way that will help them get there. It's not like memory isn't important, it's connected to understanding, yes, but we need to be able to memorize raw info. So, how do we do this? When we're sitting there with our quotations, when we've got lots of language words to learn, we need to know equations for our tests, what do we do? And what I'm going to show you is a process called semantic learning. And there are a number of different semantic learning techniques. Before we get into this is something we do in the coaching program. It's in the memory section. Our students absolutely love it. But to give you a bit of context, like I said, I'll come back to these memory champions. There's a guy called Tanzil Ali. Well, not affiliated with him. He can have this free bit of marketing, I suppose. He's an Australian memory champion. And to qualify, you need to do these crazy things. The world record for like memorizing a shuffled deck of cards is something like 12 seconds, 13 seconds. It's crazy. And they use techniques like this. So Tanzil Ali, he learned 3 languages in 3 months: Spanish, French, and Mandarin. And he wanted to learn them well enough to have a conversation and also understand it in the written form. And the way he did it was by using this substitute word method. So he would take a phrase, and I'm going to make a big apology here for my pronunciation. I'm going to attempt this in a language that I do not myself know. But the language that I'm going to use is Mandarin. Very common phrase, ni hao ma, for how are you? And the way that he would remember this is create a very provocative phrase, or a provocative story rather, for these phrases and link it together. So I think his one was something along the lines of, I don't condone this, but he was rushing into the kitchen, his mum was picking something up, he accidentally ran into her with his knee, and then he had to explain to his dad why like he'd need his ma in the head or something like that. And he would do this again and again for these strings of phrases, for lots of words, link them together. When it comes to students, we often underestimate their imagination. If they can create things that are odd, that are standing out in the crowd, they are much more likely to remember them. And that's what we're going to show here with one of these semantic learning techniques. This one here, particularly good for languages and hard definitions to remember. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use it for 2 Spanish words. Again, apologies to anyone who speaks Spanish for both my pronunciation, my accent, and also the fact that you already know these words. But here are the 2 words that we're going to learn. We're going to apply this process. So the first thing is we replace the word that we want to learn with something that sounds like it in our language. The first word here is arroz. We are going to use the English word arrows. Hopefully you caught on to that one. And then we are going to link that word, arrows, with the translation. So the way that we link those 2 words together is we create a story. The translation here for arroz is rice. So arrows and rice are going to be our 2 words or our 2 terms in the story. And then we let your imagination run wild. So yes, your child may have the tendency to get a little bit inappropriate here, which you obviously might want to stomp out, but we really want to encourage them to make these weird and these wonderful stories. So my example for the rice story is if your child is holding, say, like a bow and arrow, they've got their best friend 50 yards down there, there's a bowl of rice on their head, and they need to shoot an arrow into that bowl of rice, Robin Hood style. They let the arrow fly, everyone gasps, it hits the bowl of rice spills everywhere, everyone's happy, they get to eat, and they absolutely nail it. That's a great story. And I know it seems silly and it seems kind of infantile and immature, but that is how people remember. The more crazy that we make it, the more likely they are to remember it. Okay, moving on to my second word here, which is pluma. The word I'm going to use is puma, and the translation is pen. And I'm really sorry about this dodgy animation here, but there it goes. Maybe your story is that you're being chased through the streets by a puma, you know, you're sweating, you're running away, you think it's going to catch you, all of a sudden someone tosses you a pen, and you realize you can fend off the puma with your pen. Now, the other thing to mention is that there are more of these. This is not the only technique. We go through them in our coaching program. I'll mention them here. It's called the method of loci and mnemonic pegging. Feel free to look them up. We run through them in our coaching program. Unfortunately, I don't have time to get through them this evening. But the last thing I want to mention before we move on to the final part is about memory styles. And this comes up a lot. Parents will often ask, you know, is my child a visual learner? Are they an auditory learner? Are they a kinesthetic learner? And the only thing that we say based on the research is that it's not really a thing to be one or the other. When children or adults say that, it's not truly correct, because what we know from the research is that when we memorize, we want to use as many different senses as possible. We want to be multimodal, not unimodal. The reality is when a student says, I'm a visual learner, most likely it's because they've sat a test before, they've used a visual technique to memorize something and it has worked. And therefore that's the label that they give themselves and they feel good about that. Whereas truly what's probably happened is the fact that they had enough motivation to actually attempt something and to use a technique is the reason they actually remembered it. So again, multimodal, not unimodal. Now for Lila, our student, she ended up remembering something like 500 or 600 words using this method. She used it for her oral exam, she found it worked really well. And that is pretty much all I want to say about storage. All right, moving on to the final section. And to start this section, when we run our seminars at schools, we like to think all of our presenters can be pretty relatable so that students, they can have these nice examples. Students can say, yeah, this person gets it, they speak the same language at me. And so now my challenge at 7:35 on a Wednesday evening is to try and do the same thing with parents and create this relatable example. Now, I feel a little bit more confident in giving this example because Kieran has used it before and it was at a much more dicey time, I would say, politically charged. So hopefully there's a few more people chuckling here and less people cringing. But here we are, we're going to talk about these 2 people, these 2 students. I should probably say that Donald Trump, Joe Biden, that was a pretty intense time. I don't have any political allegiance to either one, nor does Elevate. It's not our thing. But hopefully you feel a little bit more engaged seeing their faces on the screen. Okay, so let's say they have a hypothetical. Both Donald and Joe have an exam coming up and they have to prepare for their exam. Maybe it's the exam to, I don't know, become the president. Maybe I'm reading too much into it. There are 2 students and they're going to memorize in 2 very different ways. Joe Biden is going to do 30-minute memorization sessions 4 times spaced repetitively across the next, let's say, 2 weeks. Donald Trump is going to spend 120 minutes a couple of days before the exam cramming everything in. So, going to your chat box, I'm going to ask you a question, and that is, who is going to remember more for their exam? Is it going to be A, Donald Trump, B, Joe Biden, or C, neither? Please stop mentioning these people. Because they're doing the same amount of memorization. Send in your answers. Is it going to be A, B, or C? And while those answers are coming in, I can start to see the trend that I think is going to continue while the music pops up again as well. What I expect to see, and what I am starting to see here, thank you for sending in those answers, is that innately, most people will say Joe Biden. The thing to remember though is that this mechanism for why we think Biden is going to do better is not really well known in most people, but intuitively we arrive at that conclusion that spaced repetition is much more effective, even though they're spending the same amount of time. Now, the really important underlying tenet here that we're speaking about, one really important part of memory is forgetting. That is that we really need to forget to continue to memorize. It sounds odd, but humans are amazing relearners, but we are average learners. So before I jump into that in a little bit more detail, I want to ask another question, and that is, which one of these, of our students on the screen, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, reminds you of your child? Is it A, that your child crams all the time? Is it B, they have spaced repetition? Or is it C, neither? Pretty please stop mentioning these people. Now, I'm assuming here that as you send these through, most people are going to say A. It is a really common response. Parents tell us all the time, we see it with our students, they know they do it. There is this massive tendency to cram the night before or 2 nights before, and I've absolutely harped on about it before. And so here is why it is really important to move away from that. What is on the screen is what we call the forgetting curve, coined by a person named Ebbinghaus in 1885. And he basically said the more times you review something, when you space it out, the more likely you are to remember it. And as you can see here on the chart, the first time you learn something, you forget things really quickly. That curve is really steep. If you relearn it, that curve becomes shallower. And if you relearn it again, it becomes shallower again. And what you can see is that memory begins to last longer and longer every time you relearn it. And so the consequence for our students or for your children is that if they can review information frequently, we can move away from cramming and increase our memory in the long term, which is really helpful, particularly when exams are a long, long way away. One of the big pushbacks we always get from our students is, why would I start memorizing 2 weeks before my exam if I'm just going to forget it before I start my exam? And it's a really good point. And the reason is because they are cramming and they're not reviewing again. But doing something like this actually saves you a whole bunch of time. So how on earth do we do it? If our whole tenet here is in order to remember, you must forget, we need to forget purposefully. And I'll walk you through how we recommend you do this, and you can compare what your child is doing versus what they should be doing. So when examinations come up, get your notes, use that teaching methodology. The first thing that students should do is they should review those notes immediately. You can see it down at the bottom there. Then 1 day later, then 1 week later, and finally 1 month later. Now, as a caveat, to be honest, if a child doesn't go through and do every single bit of this, that's okay. The most important thing is the early part. Learning something, then reviewing it immediately and reviewing it 1 or 2 days later. Because remember, that is how we change the gradient of the curve. Getting those first bits of review in are absolutely crucial because it decreases the rate at which we forget, and therefore you're more likely to remember things over a long point of time. So how, as parents, can you encourage your children to do this? We can use apps. This one here is Anki. It's a flashcard app. Really simple, question on the front, answer on the back. Built into this app is a timed algorithm that reminds students when they should be recalling each one of these flashcards based on that forgetting curve that I just had in the previous slide. They also have this other little nifty feature where you can kind of rate your questions or your answers on difficulty level, which will then refeed into the app. So the more difficult ones get reviewed more quickly or more frequently, and those ones that you're feeling well in control of can get pushed to the back of the line. That's one thing that works really well. Now, the other thing that also works well, and is kind of like a bonus bit here, which Sue and Lillard used, is a concept called interleaving. And what that means is that When Sue and Lila would run these tests, would do their flashcards, they would get a bunch of flashcards from heaps of different subjects and test from a random subject one at a time. Interleaving is a concept that says if you have a bunch of stuff that isn't interconnected, it's a mixture, it's not in the correct order, and if you practice by going through that randomness, then you are more likely to remember it later. Because while you are practicing, while you are testing yourself, your brain is more stretched, it becomes more flexible. And that flexibility leads to durability in terms of understanding. So download Anki, use it, and also get your children to think of all the information that they have to remember, not just silo it into one subject. Okay, that pretty much wraps it up. I'm just going to go through a few key takeaways before I get to the Q&A. Takeaway number one, focus on one thing at a time. Remove those distractions, create that environment for yourself that will help you pay more attention. The second takeaway is that rote learning is inefficient. It is an ineffective way. It is a repetitive, simple memory technique that simply just won't cut the mustard. So use something like the Feynman technique or one of those semantic learning techniques that we spoke about. And the final key takeaway that you can see here is that spaced repetition is better than mass learning. From that Joe Biden, Donald Trump example, if you are cramming everything in the fortnight before, then you are hamstringing yourself as opposed to doing it throughout a number of different sessions. All right, just about to jump into that Q&A. Please fire through your questions. Chat bubble, bottom right-hand corner if you're on our website, right-hand side if you are on YouTube. The final thing I just wanted to say is that I spoke a lot about Sue and Lila. I spoke about the coaching program tonight. If you feel like you can implement these skills with your child alone, fantastic. That is the point of these webinars. But if you feel like you might want someone else to come in to work with your child, like we did with Lila, like we did with so many families, changing that messenger can be a really effective way of enacting some behavioral change. How the coaching program works is we work with your child over 4, 8, or 12 weeks. We focus largely on how they learn. It's not tutoring, it's not content necessarily. We start by identifying the student needs, as we've spoken about before with that diagnostic assessment. We compare them with a young, fresh-faced mentor, people who have recently been through high school themselves, that have excelled through high school, and then of course there's that parent upskilling that we like to do as well to make sure everyone is on the same page. If you want to find out a bit more about that, if you want to have a chat with Maddie, our head of coaching, you can scroll down if you're on our website. At the bottom you should see Maddie's calendar, book in a time, have a 15-minute chat, or if you are on the YouTube page, that link will be in the description. If you have any questions whatsoever, and lots of parents love to claim that free first initial assessment there as well. Okay, and that brings us to the Q&A for the evening. Let me just flick across. All right. Let me have a read of these, and then I will start to answer a few of these questions as they come in. Alrighty, got a few great questions coming in here already. First one here from Karen, thanks for sending in your question. How long in advance should they start revising ideally? Great question, and the answer is unfortunately how long is a piece of string. So, what we recommend at Elevate is there's a 3-step process in terms of revising for exams. 3 things that we like to do. In the first time period, we finish off our notes, then we go to memorization, then we go to practice papers. Now, having 3 things means that we would recommend at an absolute minimum to prepare for an exam 3 weeks. That's our ideal scenario. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that every single student for the HSC or the VCE, wherever you are, should start preparing 3 weeks beforehand in November. That's probably not going to work. If there's a massive exam block with multiple exams coming up at the end of the term, at the end of the year, we do recommend stretching that out. It might be 2 weeks, 2 weeks, 2 weeks. Or if a student's feeling really good, they want lots and lots of kind of preparation and feel super confident, you can stretch it out even more. Basically, depending on how much work you have left. The other thing that I do want to quickly mention, of course, is that when we say this 3-week model, this 3-step process, students will always hit back with, but I only get 2-week notifications. And it's something I'll just address now very quickly because it is a classic thing that happens all the time. It happens to presenters, happens to parents, happens to teachers. What it really says to me is if a student is saying, there's only 2 weeks, I can't possibly do a 3-week process or a 3-step process, is that they're not quite sure of what this process involves, and it can be a bit of a lazy cop-out. What I would say is all the way throughout the term, a student can always be finishing the notes, making sure they're up to scratch, cross-checking against the syllabus, ensuring they are there. So if at the very worst scenario, you do only get 2 weeks notification, that first step, that first block of finishing your notes is pretty much already done. And you really have to spend a couple of days on it. And then you can get straight into memorization and you can leave yourself that full final week for doing those practice questions. That is going to be the most effective thing that they can do. All right, hope that answers your question. Coming in next from, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to mispronounce your name. I'm going to say Ledham or Leadham, not sure. What are your top tips for procrastination? Well, it really depends on what the problem is. Like I say with the Einstein quote, like we love to say in our time management webinar, there are so many reasons students can be procrastinating. I'll list off a few of them. I'll provide a really quick synopsis of a few tips we might recommend, and hopefully that will give you a bit of an idea. The first one, motivation. If a student doesn't know why they're studying, if they don't want to achieve anything, they don't know what they want to do at uni or what kind of mark they want to achieve, there is no way they're going to do any work. So what we usually say for students here is figure out what your goal is. Get a written goal, write it down, whether it's a mark, whether it's a uni course, whether it's, having a good CV at the end of high school, anything like that can build some motivation. The second thing I like to say about procrastination is that's the why, but the other thing is the what. If a student sits down, has all the motivation in the world, thinks, I want to go, I want to get into this incredible degree, I know what my ATAR is, I know what my marks are, but they sit down with this massive 3,000 word essay and they have no idea what to do, they are going to be sitting there looking at the screen for hours. It's really hard with these massive tasks. So what I say to students here is if you've got the why figured out, now we just need to figure out the what. And the key tip here I would say is breaking work down and writing it into a list. Break that 3,000 word essay down into multiple different research tasks, multiple different writing tasks, whether it's 100 words at a time and then you get a break. Anything that works for you to get the work done, write it in a list, cross things off as you go along, get that boost, and that is a really useful way of getting across some of that hurdle. The other thing to mention, of course, is social media, classic one, and the thing that we usually recommend there is apps. We've spoken about them in a lot of webinars, and I'm sure we will speak about them again. All right. How can you convince your child they should regularly review when they have little other homework and they can't see the immediate benefits? Yeah, really difficult one here. I assume that this is Martine, by the way, thanks for sending it in. I assume that this little other homework means they don't have such a big workload, they don't feel like it's going to be necessary. But I would actually say the exact opposite, because if there is a time period where there is low workload, it kind of suggests to me that around exam time, near the end of the term, near the end of the year, there's all of a sudden going to be this massive amount of work. And the best way to prevent stress and overwhelm in that time period is by doing just really small things all the way along. It is much easier to be confident and be in control if you're doing 15, 20, 25 minutes worth of work every single night, even if you have no other homework. And then you get to the end of the term and all of a sudden you realize you know everything. The flip side of that is you don't do anything because you feel like there's no work, and you get to the end of the term and all of a sudden you have to spend 6 hours one night cramming in all this information. It's super stressful, it's not effective. We want to avoid that situation altogether. So how can you convince your child? Maybe explaining that, maybe leaning on some of the research. It can be really, really tough to do that. Again, like I say, with some of these kind of tricky concepts for students to understand, changing the messenger can be really useful to explain some of those things. All right. From Victoria here, my daughter tries to memorize her essays of 800 to 1,000 words by reading over and over. What is a better way? Great question, Victoria. And the one that I would probably recommend is a semantic learning technique that we didn't get time to touch on. And you could really use either of the other two. Like I said, the mnemonic pegging or peg words, or the method of loci. One that I would pick because I like it more would be the method of loci, where basically for each different point in their essay, I would assign an object around my house, and I would walk through my house in my mind and interact with each of those objects. And those objects would inform what the point of the essay was going to be. And kind of that interaction might stimulate me to write 100 words or so. So there would be 8 or 10 different objects around my house to kind of get me through that process. That's a really simple explanation of method of loci. There's lots of things to do. I unfortunately don't have time to go through it tonight, but look that one up if that is something you are interested in. Mandy, how can I engage my daughter to try a one-on-one coaching session when they are reluctant and say that I don't need help? Yeah, really classic one. And I guess this is a tough one to answer straight up, because I don't actually know if they do need help. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe your daughter is all over it. I suppose the thing here is Well, there are two things rather. The first one is, in the ideal situation, your daughter does realize there are some things that she can improve. Even if she feels in control of it, there is always something that we can improve to make life easier. And figuring out exactly what that goal is going to be really useful. So yeah, maybe they're in control in year 9 or year 10, I'm not sure what year they're in, but they know that works can get more challenging in year 11 and year 12. And so having some of those skills to counteract that feeling of stress and overwhelm is something that I always recommend to families and parents, even if the student feels like they're doing well right now. The situation that we want to avoid completely is not having any study skills, feeling like we're okay, getting to year 11, getting to year 12, and all of a sudden realizing that you need them and feeling like it's too late. That's a stressful situation that we absolutely want to avoid. The other thing is, if we can somehow pass that hurdle of getting face-to-face with one of our coaches, then usually I would say that our coaches are fantastic and you won't have any troubles from there. I have full confidence in them. They're amazing people. Students connect with them so regularly and so readily that if we can get across that hurdle, I would put my faith 100% in them. And I know that's a massive plug for us, but they are fantastic people. Okay, Peter, a bit of a spicy one. The concept of interleaving, while intuitively plausible, appears to contradict the statement about the impossibility of multitasking. Could you please explain? Absolutely fantastic point, and something that we should definitely clear up. So, the concept of multitasking is doing multiple things at once, trying to attack two tasks at once, doing your history essay, focusing 100% on it, while also focusing 100% on writing an English essay, or also doing a quadratic equation, something like that. That is the impossibility. In interleaving, what I'm suggesting is you focus wholeheartedly on one part. You get asked a word in a different language, you get asked to explain a concept in history, you complete that task, you wrap it off, and then you move to a new one. You get asked a different concept from a different subject. And what you're doing is you're forcing your brain to focus, complete the task, and then move to a different thing, rather than trying to do both at the same time and half doing. That's the point. I hope that makes sense. It's a really good question, and I hope I've answered that well enough to make that clear to everyone. Okay, just a few more before we wrap up for the evening. How long do you need to implement a new technique before deciding it doesn't work for you? Really good question, Jill. It's not something that I can answer with a certain days. I wish I could tell you that, it's something like 28, 21 days, but, it's unfortunately not. I would say that for a student, if they have truly committed something in multiple iterations, let's take some weird yardstick measurement. Let's say they've truly committed something for 4 weeks and they have found that it does not increase their productivity, in whatever way. They're using it correctly, but it just doesn't click with them. Fine, move on, try something else. These techniques, not every student has to use every single technique. Pick the ones that do work for you. The way I'd probably suggest avoiding something like this, or trying to avoid something like this, is students will intuitively think, when they see these techniques, when they read about these techniques, there'll be ones that appeal to them more. Pick those ones first. Go for them. Because if a student is interested in a technique, if it appeals to them, they're more likely to actually follow through and start to use it. Again, really tricky one, but if it doesn't work for you, if you feel like you are being less productive trying this technique after a number of weeks, that's fine. Try something else or modify it somehow. All right, I think this is the final one that I'm going to answer for the evening. Is there any tips on helping students to break out of a negative mindset before they start? How to avoid the "I can't do this" comment? Great question from Tracy. An absolute favorite topic of mine, talking about mindset. So, how can we change someone's mindset before they start? Well, I would start by talking about things we should avoid. So when people are in this negative mindset, when they are exhibiting avoidance behavior, "I can't do this," pushing them into things is never going to work. Contrary to that, pulling them into things is more likely to work. Now, that is in terms of skills and techniques. The way we recommend pulling people into things is trying something yourself as a parent, as a teacher, as a friend, as a brother or sister, trying one of these techniques, showing that it works for you, and then trying to pull someone into that. "Hey, this is working for me, why don't you come join me?" That's a really good way of doing it. The other thing is to address the mindset head on. And the way that I love to do this with students is that what we really need to help students to understand is that by working at something, by changing a skill, by practicing it, they are inevitably going to get better at it. And it might not be instant, and it might not be within the first 2 weeks, but inevitably you are going to get better at this skill. The way I do that with students is I usually use sports analogies, because this is usually in relation to academics, but students understand sports analogies really well when it comes to mindset. If you want to be a fantastic soccer player, or if you want to get better at soccer, maybe you don't want to, be the best in the world, but if you want to get better at it, would you be better off saying, I can't play soccer, I'm not fast enough, I don't have the skills, or would you be better off going to training, practicing a little bit, working on your dribbling, working on your tackling, shooting a few goals, doing that once a week, then twice a week, 3 times a week? Do you think you will get better at soccer by doing that? And the answer is yes, of course. It is impossible to someone to say, no, I wouldn't get better at soccer by training more. And then we simply just change that to academics. Okay, cool. Well, if that's the case, why don't we just work on one technique at a time? Why don't we just try using a weekly planner 70% of the time for 1 week? Do you think you could get better at time management if you did that? Then we'll try and do it for 2 weeks, then 3 weeks. And what you'll start to see, hopefully, is your time management is getting better. Cool. All right. That is all the questions that I'm going to answer tonight. Thank you so much for sending those through. Thank you so much for attending tonight. Thanks for joining me in the Elevate office in HQ. I hope some of you got a good kick out of that. I certainly did. That's all for tonight. Thanks for joining us. There'll be another webinar in 2 weeks' time. We're talking about exam preparation, part 1, what to do in the lead up to those exams. And I will see you then at 7 p.m. Good night.